Who's entitled to compensation for the loss of death of a loved one in Florida? Well, this is a very interesting question. The Florida legislature has decided that it's the public policy of this state to shift the burden of the loss of a deceased person from the survivors of the deceased to the person who caused the wrongful death in cases of wrongful death. So what does that mean? It means that the survivors of the deceased person may have a viable wrongful death claim. Survivors are defined as the parents, the children, the spouse, or any relatives who are dependent upon the deceased. Those are the potential claimants in a potential wrongful death case. Now, the type of relationship that you have with the deceased is a very important factor in determining the type of damages that you may be entitled to as a result of the wrongful death. And so the first thing that the Florida Wrongful Death Act deals with is the right of the survivors to compensation for the loss of the support and services of the deceased. Okay, and every survivor has the right to compensation of the loss of support and services of the deceased in the case of the wrongful death. And the loss of support and services are basically the actions that the decedent would have done for you if they were still alive, or continued doing for you. For example, a mother or a father who's taking care of their children and doing the type of duties that a father or a mother does to take care of their children. Those activities have value. In order to get somebody to do those activities, you would have to hire a nanny and hire maybe a lawn person, and hire a housekeeper and things that the mother or father would have done. Those have value. That's loss of support. Also, the loss of financial support is a big, huge factor, of course. For children, for example, the parents support them up until they're adults, even all the way through college. The loss of financial support from a parent to a child could be huge in a wrongful death case. Even the loss of support of a parent, a surviving parent, somebody who survives the death of a child or an adult child, they're entitled to compensation for the loss of the support that the child would have given them in the future. For example, children typically will take care of their parents when the parents get older. So the parents take care of the kids when they're younger, and many children will take care of the parents when they're older. Well, that support and services that the child would have offered the parents, that has value, and that's something that that is compensable under the wrongful death statute. Okay, so there are two different elements that need to be considered when determining the rights of determining the damages available under a wrongful death claim. One of them is the estate, and one of them is the survivors. So the estate, in the event of a wrongful death case, is entitled to compensation for the economic losses related to the wrongful death case. In other words, the medical expenses of the deceased, and the funeral expenses of the funeral expenses. In addition to that, the estate is entitled to compensation for the lost net accumulation of the deceased. Now let's talk about that. First of all, what is an estate? An estate is basically the assets of the deceased minus the liabilities or the debts of the deceased. So in other words, let's say the deceased has $100,000 in assets, and then they owe $50,000 in debt. Well, then the estate, the value of the estate would be $50,000, which is assets minus liabilities, or assets minus debts. Well, in a wrongful death case, the estate is entitled to compensation for things like the medical bills, funeral expenses, but also net accumulations, and that's what I want to get to next. The net accumulations of the deceased is the amount of money that the deceased would have earned if they have lived their full life expectancy, minus the amount that they would have spent on themselves. So minus the amount of money they would have earned, minus the amount that they would have spent. If they were in a high-paying job and they were on the trajectory to make a bunch of money and make more and more money, we prove that by using the expert testimony of an economist. And we also have the economist look at their spending habits to determine how much they would likely have spent to come up with a number that we believe reflects the amount of net accumulations they would have gathered from the date of the injury until the date that they would have died if they had lived a full life to their full life expectancy. So the loss of net accumulations goes as part of the damages to the estate. Okay. In addition to that, each survivor is entitled to their own particular set of damages, and the survivor, and depending on the relationship between the survivor and the deceased. So all of the survivors are, including relatives who were dependent on the deceased, are entitled to compensation for the loss of support and services of the deceased. Okay, so that's important to note. But in addition to that, there are certain factors that are available to certain survivors in certain circumstances. For example, the spouse. The spouse of the deceased is always entitled to compensation in a wrongful death claim for loss of companionship and protection and for mental pain and suffering. Loss of companionship and protection and for mental pain and suffering. That sometimes turns out to be the biggest factor by far in determining the damages in the case, especially in a case where the spouse wasn't making a whole lot of money or didn't have a trajectory of a lot of net accumulations. There aren't medical bills, there aren't any economic losses. Sometimes the loss, the mental and emotional pain and suffering and the loss of companionship, that's everything. I've had cases where I didn't even make a claim for any sort of economic losses at all and waived any claim to economic losses because I wanted the jury to see that big number for the loss of companionship and protection and mental pain and suffering. So that's very, very, that's a very, very important element of the damages, and the spouse is always entitled to it. Minor children are always also entitled to compensation if their parent has died prematurely due to the wrongful death of another. They are also entitled to compensation for the loss of companionship and protection and for mental pain and suffering. Okay, and that's in addition to the loss of support and services. Now, in some cases, a parent who loses an adult child is entitled to compensation for their mental pain and suffering if the adult child has no other survivors. In other words, let's say the adult child has no spouse and has no minor children or has no children at all, then the parents of that adult child are entitled to compensation for mental pain and suffering. Likewise, the adult child of a parent who dies is also entitled to compensation for mental pain and suffering in the event that the parent who died has no other survivors. In other words, has no other spouse or has no spouse. In that case, then the child of an adult parent has a claim for mental pain and suffering. Okay, and so those are the essential elements of the wrongful death case. There are so many other factors in determining who is entitled to compensation for wrongful death. For example, there are situations where a complete non-family member could witness an accident or be involved in an accident with somebody who they're very close with. And there's something called the impact rule, which could entitle them to compensation for the mental pain and suffering that they endured having to witness somebody else die. So there's so many factors in determining who's entitled to compensation for wrongful death. So it's very important that if you think that you may have a wrongful death claim, you should call an experienced wrongful death attorney. My name is Jimmy Fasig. I'm the senior partner of Fasig Brooks Law Offices. I am a wrongful death attorney. I am an experienced wrongful death attorney. You're more than welcome to call me. My number is 850-777-7777. That's 850-777-7777. You're welcome to call me and talk to me about your potential case, and I'll be happy to give you my best opinions and best advice. Thank you so much.